Cosmos, Logos, and Pneuma.
Your will? My will?
I believe it was fate that we met each other.
I am Monado. I was here at the beginning, and I will proclaim the end.
This was never about the sword. We have everything we need.
Hi there. This topic happens to be one where I feel its most suitable structure is to begin from the conclusion and work backward through my explanation. The core question I'll be looking at is whether the tertiary sword in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 should be considered a Monado or not. And the answer I ultimately put forward is, yeah, definitely. The iconography of it being a laser blade belonging to the Trinity processor that has a clamshell design and ring in the middle is too iconic to the franchise to be anything else, and there are so many interweaving lore elements that strictly depend on it being so. Now then, in today's episode of I took too many screenshots and have to use them somewhere, I figured I'd arrive about 5 years late to discuss the matter of Monado as present in Xenoblade 2. This is something that's just been on my mind a lot lately thanks to a combination of Alvis reviving the Divine Sword during the XC3 Wave 4 teaser, and discovering a free camera mod for Xenoblade 1 and 2 which would let me get a proper, unrestricted look at Malos and Pneuma's blades. Which is hilariously necessary, considering the tertiary sword is so comically massive it's permanently cutting out of frame or clipping into the floor. And even when it does fit within the screen boundaries, there's so much bloom slapped onto it you can barely make out the details of the blade. Photo mode is something I really awakened to the potential of thanks to Blue Reflection's Second Light. But the FreeCam mod only works with version 2.0 and under, which I didn't have, meaning I didn't have the event theater to easily rewatch cutscenes. Yet, the prospect of getting to trawl through a Xenoblade world like that, well, let's just say that, unfortunately for me, I am exactly the person who would replay the entire main campaign solely to take a slightly zoomed out screenshot of Rex holding the inactive Monado up to Jin. It was only after I'd gone through this whole ordeal that I finally managed to locate the update files to support FreeCam and the event theater together. I don't even want to think about how much time I've spent taking these screenshots over the past 2 months. After noticing how many pre-written comments and collages I've already lined up in the slim chance they were to ever become relevant in specific niches of analysis, that's probably as good an indication as any that this topic might qualify for a more proper presentation. I suppose brain rot is the current fad term? Can't stop thinking about the Xeno. In terms of my top JRPG franchises, I do generally place Atelier above it, as I find I enjoy each individual game more there. But once you start thinking about all the interlinking mechanics of the Xeno series, it's such a unique experience. Xenoblade 2 is my favourite of them. It's a game that catches a lot of flack for its over-sexualized female designs, which is something I do have my own particular thoughts on from the angle of genre convention and internal meta-series mechanics. But that's not what I'm here to look at, as there is a specific point in the storyline where most everyone can agree the game gets good. Chapter 7 and all the madness that follows in its wake. Although you had been closely searching for links to the original game at the start, by this point you've well and truly come to accept that any similarities are only because of the Xenoblade brand, and it's otherwise unrelated to Shulk's storyline. This is intentional because the game is ever cognizant of its own design structure, to the point that, in some real sense, the potential 50 plus hours of gameplay up to this point are all entirely serving to lull you into a false sense of security. Xenoblade 2 is a JRPG that'll run you at least 80 hours on a first playthrough, yet I dare say that its entire narrative is written for the sake of one single plot twist. You start Chapter 7 thinking it'll just be more of the same, But then the party enter a dungeon under a gravestone that kind of looks like the Zohar, and upon retrieving the tertiary sword, you're made to think, hey, that ring on the sword sure does look familiar. Wait, wasn't that the shot of Earth from the Klaus flashback? And hey, Malos, what's that you got right there in your hands? Everything that the game was, builds up to, and gloriously explodes upon reaching the cliffs of Meritha. With zero explanation, Malos has a Monado, Pyra turned into Cosmos with Xenogear's wings or something, everything is an Omnigear now, and the party are tossed into a functional equivalent of the Zeboim ruins. The fantasy layer begins peeling away to hint at the conspiratorial sci-fi constructs on which the setting is built. Welcome to Xenoblade 2. That slow burn exploration of Alrest's societies and history, taking a sudden, and literal, dive off a cliff to drop you into all this apocalyptic modern imagery that wholly recontextualizes the above world is what it's all about. The game's very deliberate about presenting itself as a more happy-go-lucky counterpart to Xenoblade 1 as it works its way to this point, then mercilessly whacking you over the head with an abrupt Monado reveal. Malos' Black Sword is well fascinating to think upon. The Monado finally appears in this game, and it's in the hands of its biggest anarchist. Such a bold move, predicated on an expectation that you will be recognizing it and freaking out at every revelation from that point onward. With this one, there's no room for confusion. Malos uses a bunch of Monado arts, and the Alrest record art book plainly states it to be so. Its counterpart in this chapter though is something which has been a constant source of discourse, whether the tertiary sword is to be considered a Monado or not. In my excessive amount of replays for these two games, and my understanding of the setting based on the outer context of Xenogears and Xenosaga, which I looked through in a blog post, I would enter myself into this arena to say that it has to be. Were it not so, then I'm not sure I actually understand how Xenoblade works. Originally, I was of the stance that Malos received a Monado and Pneuma is granted vision, with each core presumed subservient to Ontos in the original Trinity processor scheme, and therefore only having half the capacity of Alvis. And I do agree that is still the safe explanation because it's the one where you don't have to spend half an hour justifying it by breaking the camera and pulling story examples from all corners of the franchise. That not one piece of documentation available calls the third sword a Monado is a hard wall to steer away from. But I also, personally, myself, think that is just a boring interpretation. Because what is Xeno if not a franchise built specifically for cross-referencing and aligning niche lore elements to reveal a hidden pathway within the setting? The storyline will offer you majority of the necessary information, but then it wants you to take responsibility for solving how these pieces slot together. And I want it to be a Monado. Xenoblade's storytelling is simply a lot cooler to me that way. All three humanoid Trinity processors have big, over-designed laser swords which hack reality by controlling the conduit's divine ether, all using an extendable clamshell design and ring-shaped guard, as well as having their relevant coloured ether lines running along the metal. When two of those are referred to as such, it's not a stretch to assume the third is as well. While at first glance Pneuma's may look like it doesn't match the base design of the other two, using mod tools to disable the excessive bloom effect covering it offers new insights. It has 3 layers of laser coating. The centermost layer has 2 prongs that form around the blade, creating a visual that resembles Shulk's weapon. A thin stream of ether spills out from the middle, suggesting that the top segment of the clamshell blade is still clamped shut and only letting a fraction of its power escape. Note that in the finale, this part does open fully like the other Monado. I've always found it odd that the earlier 2 forms of the Aegis sword have pointed tips which split when activated, yet the third sword remained sharp. As I've taken a better look at the blade's profile with FreeCam and pondered more deeply upon the circumstances surrounding it for this script, I reckon that is probably its real Monado form, which only gets accessed once in the entire game. The second laser is a smooth blade that forms around the central shaft, and the third is the large, rough field that sweeps over the weapon and gives it the appearance of a giant broadsword. Cutting out the aura to look at the middle 2 streams makes it identical to how the Monado 1 and 2 are modelled in Definitive Edition. If it looks, sounds, and has the specific lore backing of a Monado, it's probably a Monado, especially in a series as lore-centric as this one. I would purport that these divine blades are signature of the instantiated Trinity processor, and that there are only 3 genuine Monado, each aligned to the ether wavelength of one processing core. To explain my reasoning, the first order of business is to position Alvis as Ontos, which doesn't actually require much theory crafting at all. For most people, this discussion has already been and gone when Xenoblade 2 released in 2017. It's never stated plain in writing that this is the case for Ontos, but from a storytelling perspective, I'd suggest that's because this is considered to be so obvious that there'd be no point. They've already set themselves up with the recurring imagery to the point of being beyond deniability. Klaus states that upon initializing the conduit, things went screwy, which caused Ontos to spirit away his assistant Galea and half of his body. It's shown on screen that Galea is Maineth, and the absent half of Klaus is Zanza. They even feature Shulk's line from the final battle. So the dimension Ontos connected to is, in no uncertain terms, Xenoblade 1's ether subspace. Of the 2 cores left behind, Pneuma conclusively has foresight and a tentative Monado, while Logos is shown to have a definite Monado and tentative foresight. Mithra even subtly acknowledges Ontos as the red Monado when Shulk shows up as a DLC blade. Furthermore, the conversation Pyra has with Rex when they first meet mirrors the dialogue in Alvis's introduction, which is strengthened by both having access to a metaspace completely separate from the main world, referred to as memory space in the first game, which they pull the protagonist into after their death. It's arguable the dark void where Malos chases Pyra may have even been his own. Then later in the Definitive Edition remake, Alvis's necklace is changed from his original key into a red Aegis core, all of which very clearly pointing to the conclusion that the administrative computer Alvis claims to be part of is now redefined as the Trinity processor. And true to form, in the Wave 4 teaser for Xenoblade 3, it looks like the Ontos core has finally awoken and started generating light inside of it like the other 2. If Alvis is thus locked in as Ontos, a greater pool of knowledge is made available to begin unpacking the Monado system and Trinity processor with. The processor was built to be a control interface for the Conduit's divine ether. The Conduit is a meta-universe manifold which Aegis, the organization Klaus and Galea belonged to, were analyzing with the hope of controlling its phase transition capacities. In Xenogears, the original concept of phenomenon phase shift is where the Zohar calculates branching futures and then lets the contact select what one to make real, which is essentially the same function of Xenoblade's phase transition, of seeing the future through visions and altering the passage of fate with a Monado. Said power being what Alvis unleashes in full at the end to transform the universe in accordance with Shulk's wish, and which Pneuma implements for smaller scale reality hacking. The way Malos's Monado Eater skill deletes matter may also be an application. The Monado is a divine sword which can alter the composition of the world, and this capacity is shared between all 3 cores. The biggest obstacle in classing Pneuma as one is the lack of any real Monado arts, where even Maineth's sword gains access to Monado Fear and a generic Buster skill in the hands of Zanza. However, maybe the arts aren't even important since Shulk can use them with a replica, and when Rex wields the Monado 1 via DLC, he still channels his own golden ether through it with an attack that looks identical to something he had done with Pneuma prior. Rex's Monado skills don't create a symbol, even though Noah's do. Neither Maineth nor Zanza ever display any symbols on their blades either, so the arts and the symbols aren't really the be-all end-all of classification. It is true that within the game's internal coding, the only Monado weapon is Shulk's, as Pneuma retains the Aegis sword class and enemy weapons aren't categorized, so Malos isn't detailed either way, but that is evidently just because Shulk's sword is the only one you can actually view in a menu. Considering Pneuma's abilities are explicitly described as using the conduit's power to rewrite the physical laws of the surroundings and manifest what she imagines, the lack of arts becomes an increasingly small issue, because that description is precisely what the whole story of Monado in Xenoblade 1 had centered on. Broadly speaking, their abilities are the same. Looking over some scenes in FreeCam, I also noticed another quirk which I believe links the specific technique Infinity Blade back to the Monado 3, namely that a flat image is projected ahead of the sword when Shulk uses its god-slaying buster. It can be spotted for a brief second when Zanza is sliced through, but that's so quick FreeCam is the only viable way to glance over it. Such a projection attached to the third Monado makes me think about how images of Pyra and Mithra are presented alongside the physical Pneuma during Infinity Blade. They both display that trait. Additionally, Rex's final strike is something of an unannounced Monado buster, which can be seen in a more familiar form after the green ether dissipates. With a golden blade and an ether cloud following it, the buster left behind looks somewhat similar to the last attack of the Monado 3. The projected image even has the same mysterious texturing found on the Infinity Blade after image. Although the player ordinarily can't make it out, I wonder if this is something Monolith did for themselves to link the timing of the two finales. Perhaps it's a sign that the Pillars of Light for both Shulk and Rex's final attack occurs simultaneously, since their moves have these linking visual properties in place. Again illustrating the only obstacle in this discussion is that the term Monado never comes up, since her powers so obviously function in the same way. The swords themselves support this claim too. Zanza's power is released in increments, causing the Monado to appear in 3 different forms. This is the same for the Aegis sword. Whether the green-haired ascended state is Mithra's true appearance or something new created by her fusion with Pyra is never conclusively commented on, but at the very least we can tell that the true shape of the Pneuma Monado is the gigantic green sword, as evidenced by how Mithra forcibly unlocks it even before Pyra existed. Adam feared the power of the Aegis. His emotions influenced the summoning and caused Mithra to manifest in a shackled state, wielding a sword that evidently was not at full capacity. This is restricted even further when she partitions herself to create Pyra. But Pyra is still Pneuma. Though it's substantially weaker, the red Aegis sword is still mentioned to be fueled by the leftover ether from Mithra's core. And if it's running on conduit ether, there's wiggle room to treat even the first 2 forms of the Aegis sword as a kind of shackled Monado, therein having it follow the same evolution of the weapon that Shulk was using for most of his game. Another moment of interest and comparison is that as Rex picks up the white Aegis, he gets hit with a flashback of the Birth of a Universe event, perhaps to be understood as this Monado telling him of its origins in the same way Alvis told Shulk. And since the sword is semi-sentient, we see Dunban, Shulk, and Adam are all electrocuted when it chooses to reject their control. If the 2 games' narratives were unrelated, then obviously this would only be a simple reference. But they are deeply connected, and for comparison, we in fact do see that scenario in Xenoblade X with the Dark God Blade. This weapon belongs to the Vita, the so-called Vessel of the Great One, and spends most of the game enshrined in Luxar's throne room. When not in use, it's worn on the back of the mech, but once activated, that smaller clamshell hilt opens to create the laser covering, being mechanically identical to a Monado. But since Mira has dark matter in place of ether, it can only be a visual reference rather than anything to link X in the main games. Yes, this segment is only jammed in here because I replayed the entire main campaign of X solely to try and screenshot the Vita's second form holding the Dark God, which was itself then a multi-hour endeavour. However, this juxtaposition nonetheless serves to highlight the differences between a reference and something that is actually unequivocally a setting-based Monado, else we would have seen genuine Monado in XCX or XC3. That case of Xenoblade 3 further cements this. From a design standpoint, the Sword of the End and Sword of Origin have a more clear parallel to Shulk's Monado than the Tertiary Sword did. The ring opening on the guard is entirely unobstructed, Noah has kanji symbols on his arts palette, and understanding its link to Ionios and Origin reveals that its powers are implemented by hacking physical parameters to alter the passage of fate. However, even with all that in place, the fact that it doesn't have Ontos, Logos, or Pneuma backing it leaves it completely unrelated to the Conduit experiment, and it therefore cannot be classified as a Monado. It doesn't run on Ether, and there's no connection to the upper domain divinity. The Sword of the End is a phenomena produced by having Origin resonate with Melia's memories of the Monado Rex. It's simply a Monado adjacent sword, having a functionally identical relationship to Origin that the Monado did to the Conduit, further substantiating the suggestion of Pneuma's blade being a Monado. The iconography of it switching between its small and large mode is so similar that you surely are meant to look at it and think of Shulk's Monado. As one though, there are some definite peculiarities to its design I've noticed. The most obvious being that majority of the time, the tertiary sword doesn't seem to be a clamshell that opens and closes like Malus and Shulk's Monado. I'm not entirely certain in this claim because we never actually see the tertiary sword being ignited, only ever swapped into from Mithra, but that seems to be how the blade is shaped. The smaller design when completely powered down is the central cutout of its active state, and zooming into it, I can't see any hidden spikes which would unfold from that form. So I'm led to believe the green metal somehow generates and extends, instead of opening up. The one cutscene where we could potentially observe where this outer layer comes from is the lead-in to the Ion battle, since Rex has Pneuma engaged for that entire cutscene. But this is the only scenario of that sort in the game from what I can remember, and it happens so far away from the camera that they didn't bother making a unique animation for when Rex ignites it. Instead they simply use motion blur to hide that they're swapping the models. It does, however, properly unfold and have the central shaft open up during Infinity Blade. Using Xenomod's ability to freely zoom in and disable bloom even lets us discover that, although it isn't a symbol, there is an ether shape that forms in the ring to signify the technique, so it's kinda like Rex only unleashes its real power during the final attack. Another oddity which sticks out to me in its animation is the inconsistent presence of the Aegis crystal. The crystal is present in both the Tantal King's legend and Torna's depiction of the Aegis War. The sealed husk displays it clearly on the hilt, and the outline when Rex draws the sword shows a space for the core. But once the physical form appears, the Aegis is then nowhere to be seen, regardless of whether it's on or off. I considered that maybe it was encased within the middle part, but other scenes clearly show that the core crystal should be sitting atop it, similar to Malos's Monado where the Aegis juts out of it on both sides. So for most of the tertiary sword's screen time, the Aegis core is inexplicably gone, and there are a lot of shots where this section of the blade is in plain sight, so I can't imagine it being something the devs removed from cutscenes merely to save resources. It only reappears after the activation of Infinity Blade and then vanishes again immediately after. This all seems quite deliberate, but I just don't have any significant reading as to what implication we were meant to be taking from it. Every other blade weapon in the game has its core crystal clearly displayed, so maybe it's something subtle like that it becomes a Monado in the hands of a chosen human and a blade weapon when in contact with Pneuma, based on the fact that one of her combat skills, which you have to hack the game to see, is called the Chosen One. That's the best I could do to hazard a guess, but we never see flashback of a Malthus actually wielding Malos's Monado for a conclusive answer. Gaining access to his Monado is what Malos describes as regaining his full Aegis powers, and the Architect identifies that Pneuma's power will run dry once Alvis sends away the Conduit and Monado to enact Shulk's wish for a world without gods. Ergo, the Monado has ample ground to be considered the signature tool of a biologically manifested Trinity processor avatar. That checks out quite well for me. However, this does leave open the question of Zanza and Mayneth's swords. For this part of the discussion, I believe that, like most things in the Xeno meta series, we are best served by looking at its origin point in Xenogears. This franchise cannot be a multiverse due to the wave existence having a vastly different personality in each subseries, but it is still true that each Xeno game is interpreting some section of the overhanging Perfect Works timeline. A large selection of story elements are repeated in the process, meaning that we can often look at the previous subseries in order to find clarification of any setting mechanics. In this case, I seek the computer brain Katamoni and what implication it carries when its design precepts are translated for the Xenoblade narrative. To put it simply, Katamoni is a Trinity AI supercomputer designed to let a bioweapon called Deus channel power from the infinite energy engine Zohar. There are four main components of this machine: a bioplant which can produce a humanoid as its embodiment if need be, and the three minds which comprise its computer brain. The basic command flow is that the Overseer AI persona passes a prompt to its selfish male mind, Animus, and its selfless female mind, Anima, to morally and logically debate. Once these two manage to reach a decision, persona authorizes that instruction to be uploaded to the Zohar. Only then may its terrifying cosmic power be invoked. If that arrangement sounds familiar at all, it's because this is more or less the exact functioning of the Trinity processor. The neutral Inquisitor persona is represented by androgynous Ontos/Alvis. The destructive male mind Animus becomes the hypermasculine Logos, and the motherly Anima is then hyperfeminine Pneuma. In order to cement this link in place, we need only note that Malos's personal battle theme in Torna the Golden Country is called Over Despair and Animus, while Pyra and Mithra's weapons are renamed the Anima Sword when Queen Nia wields them in Xenoblade 3, since she herself is not an Aegis. Of further interest may be that Deus from Xenogears, Omega from Xenosaga, the Vita from Xenoblade X, and Artifice Ion from Xenoblade 2 are all interpretations of that same Zohar-fueled god weapons story concept, and the Conduit is likewise just a legally distinct version of the classic Zohar, a giant golden monolith that acts as a perpetual motion machine by opening a path to the upper domain and ensnaring an existence which can commonly be considered God. Xeno is a deeply self-referential series where the intertextual links number to a far too overwhelming degree to ever attempt tackling in a video. Interestingly, this is a situation where Katamoni honestly seems to matter more to Xenoblade than it did in Xenogears. Its trinity is so deeply ingrained to the core mythos that I feel this has to be the key in understanding the Aegis and their relationship with Monado. You have Persona/Ontos/Alvis with one Monado, which just seems disproportionately powerful since that universe has ether as the base element and its semi-simulated nature elevates his computer functions. Animus/Logos/Malos with another, and Anima/Pneuma/Mithra with the last. You'll notice that I'm hard committing to the idea of a Monado trinity despite there being 5 distinct Monado in the series. There are a number of reasons for that. Although the original Xenoblade seems to have a multitude of Monado at first glance, it's actually only 3 swords appearing in different shapes. Zanza's Monado evolves through 3 stages, where it's shackled, unshackled, and then restored to its true form in the hands of a god. Since he and Bionis are considered 2 parts of the same body, its Monado is also to be considered an extension of his own, rather than a unique instance. Zanza's Guardians, which display skills such as Monado Eater and Monado Lock, are probably a similar case. Moving on to look at Maineth, her Monado is first seen as the core in Fiora's chest. After awakening, it's then shown in 2 configurations. She and Fiora use them as dual blades, whereas Zanza combines them into a single sword. I find it a bit strange that while the Bionis has a Monado, the Mechonis only uses a metallic sword. So I do have some speculation as to whether the distinctly Monado-shaped building in Aganatha is meant to be her original Monado 1 moulded into a different shape. Egil powers the sword, Mechonis, and faces by melting Homs in Galahad Fortress, but Maineth surely would have never done so when ruling. If the structure in Aganatha was her Monado, then that would instead be where she originally generated enough ether to power the entire Mechonis. It's food for thought anyway. Lastly, there's Shulk's sword, referred to as the Monado 3 despite actually being a totally separate weapon to the Monado 1 and 2. The Monado progression is meant to loosely mirror Veltal, where it evolves through the Berserk Veltal Id and bulkier Veltal 2, so that it may end up becoming the titular Xenogears. Veltal, the Contact, and Xenogears are all referred to as the Slayer of God, and the Monado 3's musical theme is titled The God-Slaying Sword. The links are abundant and immediate. Conceptually, the Monado system is Veltal converted for a different setting. I went on a tangent there, but basically, 3 flavors of Monado and a Xenogears parallel baked in. This is where Katamoni comes into play, because applying it as a lens permits the swords of Xenoblade to actually be the same trinity repeated. The relevance this framework carries for Zanza and Maineth holding Monado is that both were already an implementation of the Animus-Anima concept. It's one of the longest standing Xeno setting mechanics, which is seen in every single title. So before any kind of franchising content was ever conceptualized, Takahashi had inadvertently placed a bunch of this Xenogears imagery into Xenoblade anyway. You have the destructive male force Zanza engaged in what amounts to religious warfare against the protective mother Mayneth who simply wishes to let the world grow. The pair borrow the same blue and red glow that was assigned to Yeshua and Mary in Xenosaga, since the purple and green of Malos and Mithra simply hadn't been designed yet. Alvis's incorporation into the conduit experiment being a retcon means that it comes with this implicit understanding that even back when Xenoblade was a standalone title, he was already stand-in for Persona. I think this is a big part of why the stories of these two games are able to slot together so naturally despite displaying such major differences in style. The Katamoni structure was present in Xenoblade well before the Trinity processor. So while the processor and its other two cores were a rewrite introduced by the sequel, they are still clear evolutions of the Monado triad imagery from Sentient Genesis. It was already apparent that with Persona, Animus, and Anima united in the finale, the requirements of Katamoni had been fulfilled, and Alvis was then contacting an unseen Zohar to instigate universal phase transition. Because the role of Animus is shared between Malos and Zanza, and the role of Anima shared between Pneuma and Mayneth, I conclude that the new explanation embedded into Xenoblade 2 is that those gods were using substitute Monado regenerated by Ontos in order to fill a pseudo-Trinity processor construct, partitioning his power so that the offshoots are recognized as Pneuma and Logos. He completes Katamoni and regains capacity to send command to the Zohar. We joke about Alvis being a chaotic neutral jerk who let Zanza rampage for eons, but it might genuinely be that he couldn't do anything until all three Monado elements had been assembled under one will. Zanza wields a replica Logos, while Mayneth wields a replica Pneuma, hence why the true Monado is the last one gifted by Alvis himself. It becomes understood as the actual Ontos Monado, what would probably be his Aegis sword if he had ever been converted to the Blade system. This also adds an extra layer to the Aegis war in Torna the Golden Country, since the imagery of Malos and Mithra flying around destroying everything with their Monado is a clear parallel to the fight when Zanza and Mayneth awaken in Chapter 16 of Xenoblade. And so, this is my take on the Monado as shared between the divinity of Bionis and Alrest. It isn't something so vague as the Monado being inside of us all along, or there being infinite possibility to summon it if a character has strong enough willpower. That's too easy for a series which describes the workings of its universe as meticulously as Xeno. No, 3 distinct swords with 2 substitutes created. To me, this ties it up neatly. For the very blatant link to Alvis and Malos, I think it's more of a stretch to argue that Pneuma's isn't a Monado. The Trinity processor conduit relationship, or at least as far as I've pieced it together, kind of necessitates it being so, and this is only compounded by the Katamoni homage.